downstairs to see her husband trying to force the heavy wooden slab back into its frame. "What happened?" "I don't know," George answered, finally forcing the door closed. This thing was wide open, hanging on one hinge. "Here, look at this." He pointed to the brass lock plate. The doorknob was twisted completely off-center. The metal facing was bent back, as though someone had tried to pry it open with a tool, but from the inside. Someone was trying to get out of the house, not in. "I don't understand what's going on around here," George muttered, more to himself than Kathy. "I know I locked this door before I went upstairs. To open the front door from in here, all you had to do was turn the lock." "Is it the same way outside?" Kathy asked. "No, there's nothing wrong with the knob or the outside plate. Somebody'd need an awful lot of strength to pull away a door this heavy and tear it off one of the hinges." "Maybe it was the wind, George," Kathy offered hopefully. "It seems to get pretty strong out there, you know." "There's no wind in here, much less a tornado. Somebody or something had to do this." The Lutzes looked at one another. Kathy was the first to react. "The kids!" She turned and ran up the stairs to the second floor and into Missy's bedroom. A small light in the shape of Yogi Bear was plugged into the wall near the bottom of the little girl's bed. In its feeble glow, Kathy glimpsed the form of Missy lying on her stomach. "Missy," Kathy whispered, leaning over the bed. Missy whimpered, then turned over onto her back. Kathy let out a sigh of relief and tucked the covers up under her daughter's chin. The cold air that had come in while the front door was open had made even this room very chilly. She kissed Missy on the forehead and silently slipped out of the room, heading for the third floor. Danny and Chris were sleeping soundly. Both were on their stomachs. Remember, everybody, the DeFeo family were all found lying on their stomachs when they were shot and killed. Later, when I thought about it, Kathy says that was the first time I could ever remember the children sleeping in that position, particularly all three on their stomachs at the same time. I even remember I was almost going to say something to George that it was kind of strange. In the morning, the cold spell that gripped Amityville was still unbroken. It was cloudy, and the radio kept promising snow for Christmas. In the hallway of the Lutz home, the thermostat still read a steady 80 degrees, but George was back in the living room, stoking the fire to a roaring blaze. He told Kathy that he just couldn't shake the chill from his bones, and he didn't understand why she and the children didn't feel that way too. The job of replacing the doorknob and lock assembly on the front door was too complex for even a handy individual like George. The local locksmith arrived about 12, as he promised. He made a long, slow survey of the damage inside the house, and then gave George a peculiar look. Kathy's one comment was that the DeFeos had called him a couple of years before. They were having trouble with the lock on the boathouse door. He had been called to change the lock assembly because once the door was closed from the inside, it would somehow jam, and whoever was in the boathouse couldn't get out. George wanted to say more about the boathouse, but when Kathy looked at him, he held back. They didn't want the news spreading around Amityville that again there was something funny going on at 112 Ocean Avenue. By 2 in the afternoon, the weather had begun to warm. A slight drizzle was enough to keep the children in the house. George still hadn't gone to work and was in constant transit between the living room and the basement, adding logs and checking on the oil burner. Sorry guys, I lost my place there for a moment. Danny and Chris were up in their third floor playroom, noisily banging their toys around. Kathy was back at her cleaning chores, putting shelf paper in the closets. She had worked her way almost to her own bedroom on the second floor when she looked in Missy's room. The little girl was sitting in her diminutive rocking chair, humming to herself as she stared out the window that looked towards the boathouse. Kathy was about to speak to her daughter when the phone rang. She picked up the extension in her own bedroom. It was her mother, saying that she would be over the next day, Christmas Eve, and that Kathy's brother Jimmy would bring them a Christmas tree as a housewarming gift. Kathy said how relieved she was that at least the tree would be taken care of, since she and George had been unable to rouse themselves to do any shopping at all. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Kathy saw Missy leave her room and enter the sewing room. Kathy was only half listening to what her mother was saying. What could Missy possibly want in there where all the flies had been the day before? She could hear her 5-year-old daughter humming, moving about some still unopened cardboard boxes. Kathy was about to cut her mother short when she saw Missy come back out of the sewing room. started it, Danny scowled. Started what? What are you fighting about? Kathy demanded, her voice rising. There was no answer from either boy. Both suddenly withdrew from their mother. Whatever happened, Kathy sensed it was their affair, not hers. Then her patience snapped. What is going on around here? First, it's Missy with her angels, and now you two idiots trying to kill each other. Well, I've had it. We'll just see what your father has to say about all this. You're both going to get it later, but right now, I don't want to hear another peep out of either of you. Do you hear me? Not another sound. Shaking, Kathy returned downstairs to do her shelving. Cool down, she told herself, as she passed Missy's room again. The little girl was humming the same strange tune to herself. Kathy wanted to go in, but then thought better of it and continued on to her own bedroom. She would talk to George later, when she had a chance to be calmer about the whole affair. Kathy picked up a roll of shelf paper and opened the door to the walk-in closet. Immediately, a sour smell struck her nostrils. Oh God, what is that? She pulled the light chain hanging from the closet ceiling and looked around the small room. It was empty except for one thing. On the very first day the Lutzes had moved in, she had hung a crucifix on the inner wall facing the closet door, just as she had done when they lived in Deer Park. A friend had originally given her the crucifix as a wedding present. Made of silver, it was a beautiful piece, about 12 inches long, and had been blessed a long time before. As Kathy looked at it now, her eyes widened in horror. She began to gag at the sour smell, but couldn't retreat from the sight of the crucifix, now hanging upside down. December 24th. It was almost a week since Father Mancuso had visited 112 Ocean Avenue. The eerie episodes of what that day and night were still much on his mind, but he had discussed them with no one, not with George and Kathy Lutz, not even with his confessor. During the night of the 23rd, he had come down with the flu. The priest had alternated between chills and sweating, and when he finally got up to take his temperature, the thermometer read 103 degrees. He took some aspirin, hoping to break the fever. This was the Christmas season, and with it began a host of clerical duties, particularly a particularly bad time for a priest to be indisposed. Father Mancuso fell into a troubled sleep. Around 4 in the morning of Christmas Eve, he awoke to find his temperature now up to 104 degrees. He called the pastor to his room. His friend decided to get a doctor. While Father Mancuso waited for the physician, he thought again of the Lutz family. There was something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He kept envisioning a room he believed to be on the second floor of the the need for some time to be by herself, and this was to be her own personal room. She had also considered the room, along with the kitchen, for her meditation. That third bedroom on the second floor would also serve as a dressing room and storage place for her and George's growing wardrobes. Among the cartons in the sewing room were boxes of Christmas ornaments that she had accumulated over the years. It was time to unwrap the balls and lights, get them ready to put on the tree her mother and brother had promised to bring over that evening. After lunch, Kathy asked Danny and Chris to bring the cartons down to the living room. Sorry, guys. George was more interested in his fireplace logs and only half-heartedly worked on the Christmas lights, testing the many colored bulbs and disentangling their wires. For the next few hours, Kathy and the children were busy unwrapping tissue paper that enclosed the delicate, bright-colored balls, the little wooden and glass angels, Santas, ice skaters, ballerinas, reindeer, and snowmen that Kathy had added to each year as the children grew up. Each child had his own favorite ornaments and tenderly placed them on towels Kathy had spread on the floor. Some dated back to Danny's first Christmas, but today the children were admiring an ornament that George had brought to his new family. It was an heirloom, a unique galaxy of crescents and stars, wrought in sterling silver and encased in 24-karat gold. There was a fixture on the back of the 6-inch ornament that let one attach it to a tree. Crafted in Germany more than a century before, it had been given to George by his grandmother, who in turn had received it from her own grandmother. The doctor had come and gone from the rectory. He confirmed that Father Mancuso did indeed have the flu, and advised the ailing priest to remain in bed for a day or so. The fever was in his system and could remain high for another 24 hours. My cat is snoring if you hear anything weird. He's just right up there in the cat tree, just snoring his buggery little face off. Anyway, Father Mancuso chafed at the idea of remaining idle. He had so much work to do. He agreed that upcoming items on his busy calendar could be put off for a week, but some of his clients in counseling could not afford the same kind of postponement. Nevertheless, both the physician and pastor insisted that Father Mancuso would only prolong his illness if he insisted upon working or leaving his apartment. There was one thing he could still do, however, and that was to call George Lutz. The bad feeling he had about that second floor room remained, and it made him as restless as his fever. Excuse me. When he finally made the call, it was 5 p.m. Danny answered the telephone and ran to get his father. Kathy was surprised by the call, but not George. Sitting by the fireplace, he had been thinking about the priest all day. George had felt an urge to call Father Mancuso, but couldn't decide just what he wanted to say. was sorry to hear of Father Mancuso's flu and asked if there was anything he could do. Assured there was nothing any man could do to relieve the priest's discomfort, George began to speak of what was happening in the house. At first, it was a light conversation. George told Father Mancuso about bringing down the ornaments to trim the Christmas tree that Jimmy, his brother-in-law, would be delivering at any moment. Father Mancuso interrupted George. I have to talk to you about something that's been on my mind. Do you know the room on your second floor that faces the boathouse? The one where you had all those unopened boxes and cartons? Sure, Father. That's going to be Kathy's sewing and meditation room when I get the chance to fix it up. Good Lord, Puka. Where was I? Oh, hey, you know what we found in there the other day? Flies. Hundreds of house flies. Can you imagine in the middle of winter? George waited for the priest's reaction, and he got it. George, I don't want you or Kathy or the children to go back into that room. You have to stay out of there. Why, Father? What's up there? Before the priest could answer, there was a loud crackling on the phone. Both men pulled back from their earpieces in surprise. George couldn't make out Father Mancuso's next words. All that remained was an irritating static noise. Hello? Hello? Father? I can't hear you. There must be a bad connection. From his end, Father Mancuso was also trying to hear George through the static and only faintly heard the hellos. Finally, the priest hung up, then dialed the Lutz's number again. He could hear the phone ringing, but no one picked it up. The priest waited for 10 rings before he finally gave up. He was very disturbed. When he could no longer hear Father Mancuso through the crackling, George had also hung up his receiver. He waited for the priest to call back. For several minutes, he sat in the kitchen and stared at the silent telephone. Then he dialed Father Mancuso's private number at the rectory. There was no answer. In the living room, Kathy began wrapping the few Christmas gifts that she had accumulated before moving to Amityville. She had gone to a sales at Sears and to the Green Acres shopping center in Valley Stream, picking up bargains in clothing for her children and other items for George and her family. Sadly, Kathy noted that the pile of boxes was rather small and silently It must be my mother. George, there you're all ready, and I haven't even started supper. As she hurried toward the kitchen, you get the door. Kathy's brother, Jimmy Connors, was a big, strapping youth who genuinely liked George. That evening, his face exuded a special warmth and charm. He was to be married on the day after Christmas, and had asked George to be his best man. But when mother and son entered the house, Jimmy lugging a sizable Scotch pine, both their faces changed at the sight of George, who hadn't shaved or showered for almost a week. Kathy's mother, Joan, was alarmed. "Where are Kathy and the kids?" she asked George. "She's making supper, and they're up in the playroom." "Why?" "I just had the feeling something was wrong." This was the first time his in-laws had visited the house, so George had to show his mother-in-law where the kitchen was located. Then he and Jimmy hefted the tree into the living room. "Boy, that's some fire you've got going there." George explained that he just couldn't warm up, hadn't been able to since the day they moved in, and that he had already burned 10 logs that day. "Yeah," Jimmy agreed, "it does seem kind of chilly around here. Maybe there's something wrong with your burner or thermostat." "No," answered George. "The oil burner's working fine, and the thermostat's up to 80 degrees. Come on down to the basement, and I'll show you." In the rectory, Father Mancuso's doctor had warned him that one's body temperature normally rises after 5 in the afternoon. Even though he was uncomfortable and his stomach hurt, the priest's mind kept turning to the strange telephone problems that the Lutzes were having. It was now 8 o'clock, and his repeated attempts to contact George had been fruitless. Several times he had asked the operator to check to see if the Lutz's phone was out of order. Each time it rang intermittently until a supervisor called him back to report no service problems with the line. Why hadn't George called him back? Father Mancuso was sure George had heard what he said about the second floor room. Was there now something terribly wrong? Father Mancuso did not trust 112 Ocean Avenue. He could wait no longer. He dialed a number he normally used only for emergencies. The Christmas tree was up at the Lutz's home. Danny, Chris, and Missy were helping their Uncle Jimmy trim it and urging him to hang up his own ornaments first. George had returned to his own private world by the fireplace. Kathy and her mother were in the kitchen talking. This was her happy room, the one place in the new house where she felt secure. She complained to her mother that George had changed since they moved in. "Ma, he won't take a shower. He won't shave. He doesn't even leave the house to go into the office. All he does is sit by that damn fireplace and complain about the cold. And another thing, every night he keeps going out to check that boathouse." "What's he looking for?" Mrs. Connors asked. "Who knows? All he keeps saying is he's got to look out around there and check on the boat." "That doesn't sound like George. Have you asked him if there's anything the matter?" "Oh, sure." Kathy threw up her hands. "And all he does is throw more wood on the fire. In 1 week, we've gone through almost a whole didn't say a word to either woman, just ran up the stairs. "What's with him?" Mrs. Connors asked. Kathy just shrugged. "See what I mean?" She began to arrange the Christmas gifts under the tree. When Danny, Chris, and Missy counted the meager number of prettily wrapped presents on the floor, there was a chorus of disappointed voices behind her. "What are you crying about?" George was back, standing in the doorway. "Knock it off. You kids are too spoiled anyway." Kathy was about to snap back at her husband for yelling at the children in front of her mother and brother when she saw the look on George's face. "Did you open the window in the sewing room, Kathy?" "Me? I haven't been up there all day." George turned to the children near the tree. "Have any of you kids been up in that room since you brought down the Christmas boxes?" All three shook their heads. George hadn't moved from his position in the doorway. His eyes returned to Kathy. "George, what is it?" "A window is open, and the flies are back." Crack! Everyone in the room jumped at the loud sound that came from somewhere outside. Again came a sharp knock, and outside Harry barked. "The boathouse door, it's open again." George turned to Jimmy. "Don't leave them alone. I'll be right back." He grabbed his parka from the hall closet and headed for the kitchen door. Kathy began to cry. "Kathy, what's going on?" Mrs. Connors said, her voice rising. "Oh, Mama, I don't know." A man watched as George came out of the side door and ran toward the back of the house. He knew the door led from the kitchen because he had been at 112 Ocean Avenue before. He sat in a car parked in front of the Lutz's home and observed George shut the boathouse door. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 11 o'clock. The man picked up the microphone of the car radio. "Samarato, this is Gianfrido. You can call your friend back and tell him the people in 112 Ocean Avenue